Hey everyone, this is Andrew and welcome to my Synthesizer Basics course. In this video I'm going to introduce you to the very basic concepts of synthesis. I'm going to show you some of the knobs on an example software synthesizer like you see here. I'm going to show you some kind of basic concepts that will guide you through the rest of the videos in this course. So since in this video I'm just going to go over kind of each of the main controls on a generic synthesizer, the first category that we're going to want to talk about is oscillators. Another term for that is a VCO, which is a voltage controlled oscillator. In a software synth, sometimes they're still called VCOs, even though they're not, they're software controlled. But oscillator, VCO, different terms for it. In this case, we have a synthesizer with 3 different oscillators. I have 2 of them turned off, so I just have oscillator 1 turned on. And basically what's going to happen is, depending on which one I have selected here, it's going to play that oscillator every time I press a key. In this case, I have a triangle wave selected. If I open up an EQ, we can see what the spectrum of this triangle wave looks like. So this is kind of the fundamental, or the note you're actually hearing. So as I go higher, you can see that that strongest fundamental gets higher. And all of these other little ripples are harmonics of the fundamental, so that's certain kind of intervals of the main fundamental frequency depending on what kind of wave we're actually playing. If I switch this to a more, or a kind of a mix between a saw and a triangle wave, it sounds a little more like it's brassy, like it's got more high frequency content when you hear it. That's reflected in the EQ. You have a lot more of these harmonics. If you go to a pure saw wave, even more so. Then you go to a square wave, and it's still got a lot of harmonics, but it's a different type of wave. And then the rest of these are just different types of square waves. So I'll go to the saw for a sec. And just looking at the synth, you can tell that it goes from the oscillator section into a mixer, into these filters, and then into some kind of loudness control when it gets output. And this is a generic format that every synthesizer, or every subtractive synthesizer, actually follows for the most part. So if I stay in my saw wave and I start playing with the filter, take a look at what happens to the EQ. So now it looks a lot like that triangle wave we saw before. And if I actually put this back up and switch the triangle wave, put that down, switch to the saw wave, they sound a lot more similar now. They're both kind of dull or bassy, and that's because they don't have that high frequency content anymore. So this kind of demonstrates the core concept behind subtractive synthesis, which is you start off with a very harmonically rich sound wave, and then you filter it down until you get the sound you actually want. So another thing I played with this filter over here, but there are other ways to control the filter. So if I bring this down, and then I'll play with the filter emphasis, you'll see what happens. Now we're actually getting a peak that occurs at a certain point. And what this is called is, it could be called the emphasis, but usually it's called the resonance of the filter. And if I play with the filter on here, if I put on, this is called a low-pass filter because it only lets the low frequencies pass. This is changing the cutoff of that filter, which is similar to changing the cutoff on here. I can also change the Q, which is another term for resonance or emphasis, up. And that's going to change the kind of resonant point or the emphasis point of the filter. So I'll bring that up and turn that off for now. But you'll see what I mean as I move this around. And that's the basics behind filters. Now this last control here is the amount of contour, which is another fancy term for the amount of influence the envelope has on the filter. Now the next big concept, as I mentioned, the sound comes from the oscillators, it goes to a mixer, it goes to a filter, and it goes to loudness control to get output. In your loudness control, you have something called an envelope, or another term is ADSR, or AR, or AD. So a lot of different terms, but basically it's an envelope with control some kind of on or off feature of the synthesizer. So if I put my decay time down and my attack time down, listen to what happens. Instantly on and instantly off when I let go. If I put the attack time up, let me put this filter back up. So now the attack time's up, it takes a longer time for the note to come on. If I bring this down, now it comes on instantly. The opposite happens for the decay. So right now it turns off instantly. So if I bring the decay time up, it's going to turn off kind of slowly. Oh, it's still ringing out. Now in this particular synth, it also has a sustain level. So I can actually make it so that it only comes up to a certain level. So I'll make the attack a little slower. See how it kind of dies down to the sustain point. That's just a different control you get. Now sometimes on synths you'll have attack, decay, sustain. You might have attack, decay, sustain, release. You might have attack, hold, decay, sustain, release, and the list goes on and on for different combinations. But that's kind of the basic premise. Now, before this came up because I was talking about the filter. And you notice that when I was playing with the filter, that when I had the resonance up and the cutoff down, see how I get that sweep? Now that's because I actually have this contour on, which is a separate envelope that's applied to the filter. So if I put this higher, now what happens when I play it lower? And then all the way off. And this just controls, how much this envelope actually applies to the filter. So I can make that come on very slowly. If I make this emphasis kind of high and this filter cut off very low. And I'm just putting this emphasis on for effect. Usually you'd have it a little more subtle. Make the release time really long. And that's those parameters. So that's kind of the basics behind everything. Now, obviously, there is a lot more different parameters that can come into play with the synthesizer, but that's kind of the core functionality behind every subtractive synthesizer. You're going to have some kind of oscillators, you're going to have a filter, you're going to have one or two or more envelopes. Now, there's other features such as LFOs, low frequency oscillators, there's noise, there's other types of modulation sources, of course, there's effects, and, a lot more. In this case, I'll just show you kind of what happens when I start turning on these other sounds. I'm going to put on this second oscillator here. I hit a note, and in this case I have to hold shift and move this, so I'll make it more extreme. Even more extreme. That's a little too much. That should be good. I can bring in this third oscillator here, and I'll put it up 7 semitones. Oh, I did 8. There we go. And this explains another core concept behind a lot of subtractive synthesizers. Having one oscillator can sound kind of thin at times. So one trick of the trade is to either get a second oscillator tuned down an octave or detuned, in the semi-sense kind of range, meaning it's tuned down a very, very tiny amount, which just adds a lot of thickness to the sound. And another concept is that you can tune a different oscillator to to a different pitch entirely, so you're actually playing a chord every time you play a key, or an interval every time you play a key. You can also mix noise into the picture. And then you can actually change the glide time between notes. So and that just determines how fast or slow it transitions into the next note. So at risk of making this video have too much information in it, I'm going to stop there. This is just meant to show you kind of the basics of each category of a traditional synth, and then share with you some of the kind of extra little things you can add on in this particular synth. So in the next video, we're going to dive down into much more detail on just oscillators. And I'm going to also start digging into some hardware synthesizers so you can get a different feel for how different synths look and act over the course of this series. So if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, leave some comments if you have any questions, and subscribe to stay updated for when I add the next video in this series. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.